The recording of the 112 call begins with static and the sound of rain. The man's voice on the line is tense and halting. He introduces himself to the dispatcher as Jan Kowalski, a truck driver, and explains that he went off course due to a GPS malfunction and ended up on a country road near the abandoned village of Żarki. His truck is stuck, and Jan got out to figure out his location using a paper map. That's when he heard an unusual sound, one that clearly didn't fit with the noise of the rain. A muffled, metallic knock. 3 hits, then a pause of a few seconds, and then 3 more hits. The sound was rhythmic and came from a nearby abandoned house. Approaching closer and illuminating the entrance with his flashlight, Kowalski noticed a mess: broken bottles, boarded-up windows, and trash inside. The door was slightly ajar, and he could see a massive hatch in the floor, locked with a heavy padlock. The knocking was clearly coming from under the hatch. He immediately moved away from the house and reported his exact location to the dispatcher, noting that the village had been deserted for a long time, so there shouldn't be anyone inside. A patrol from the nearest town of Chranów was dispatched and would arrive in 20 minutes to assess the situation and find out who was signaling from the basement of the abandoned house. To understand how Jan Kowalski ended up in the abandoned village in the first place, one must go back several hours. That evening, Jan was on a standard run. He had been hauling cargo for almost 20 years and knew the A4 highway from Katowice to Kraków well. In the trailer were auto parts, a routine delivery with no particular surprises. Jan was supposed to reach Kraków by morning, planning only a short stop for coffee. The rain intensified around the town of Chranów. For an experienced driver like Jan, this was business as usual. He calmly turned on the wipers, lowered the radio volume, and continued to watch the road attentively. Around 11 at night, the navigator unexpectedly suggested he turn onto road DW934, citing roadworks ahead. Jan was a little surprised, but saw no reason not to trust the technology. He turned off his usual route, expecting to get back on the main highway soon. At first, the road looked normal, but soon the asphalt turned to gravel, and then to a broken country road. It became obvious that trucks hadn't driven here in a long time. Moving forward was difficult, and the size of the truck made turning around impossible. A few minutes later, the truck's wheels finally got stuck in the wet ground. After shutting off the engine, Jan took a paper map from the glove compartment to figure out his location. There wasn't a single light, street light, or sign of life around. Only the sound of rain, the night, and the dark outlines of abandoned buildings nearby. It was then that he first heard the sound that clearly stood out from the monotonous noise of the rain. A clear, metallic knock, distinct strikes, a pause, and then the strikes repeating. It was clearly a signal. Jan took his flashlight and cautiously got out of the truck, heading toward the abandoned house. The sound was coming from there, as if someone was trying to get attention. 20 minutes later, a police patrol from the nearby town of Chranów was already on its way. Jan didn't yet know that his ordinary work trip had just turned into the beginning of a real nightmare. But while the patrol was still on its way, Jan decided to check the house himself. Just standing and waiting was impossible. He took his flashlight and headed toward the building, moving slowly through the wet, rain-soaked ground. The sound of the rain drowned out other noises, but the metallic knocks were still distinct. The house looked as if no one had been there for a long time. The windows were boarded up. The roof had caved in, and the planks were damp and rotten. The door was the only thing that was different. It was slightly ajar, as if someone had recently gone in or out. Stopping at the threshold, Jan shone his flashlight inside. First, he noticed scattered bottles and old things, traces of a fire on the floor, and a dirty mattress in the corner. The smell was heavy, damp, and unpleasant. He took a step inside, carefully testing each section of the floor with his foot before proceeding. The wooden planks creaked under his weight. The knocking grew louder. Now Jan clearly understood that the sound was coming from somewhere beneath the floor. He followed the direction of the sound with his flashlight and saw old metal heating pipes going down, straight to a massive metal hatch set into the floor. The hatch was secured with a heavy padlock that didn't look abandoned. There was no rust or dirt on it. It had clearly been used recently. For a few seconds, the knocking from below stopped. Jan listened more closely and heard a quiet but distinct rustle, as if someone below had frozen, listening to his actions above. He slowly leaned towards the hatch and quietly said that help was on the way. Immediately, a new series of knocks rang out in response, even louder, more desperate. It was clear that the person below had heard him and was now practically begging him not to leave. It was impossible to open the hatch without tools. Jan stepped back, headed for the exit, and went back out into the rain, feeling a growing tension and anxiety. Returning to his truck, he turned on his hazard lights to make it easier for the police to find him. Jan checked his phone again, made sure he had a signal, and waited by the cab. The minutes until the patrol's arrival seemed endless. Jan tried to understand how it could be that someone was locked in the basement of this abandoned house. After some time, the headlights of a police car appeared in the distance. It was at that moment that it became clear. The truck driver's ordinary work trip had already turned into a terrifying story, and it was only just beginning. The headlights of the patrol car illuminated the rain-washed road near the house. The time was 11:35 p.m., October 14th, 2023. Jan immediately waved, showing the officers where to go. Two police officers got out of the car and silently surveyed the scene before heading to the entrance. They moved confidently and quickly, clearly understanding the seriousness of the situation. Upon entering, the officers paused briefly, scanning the room. The beams of their flashlights slowly slid across the walls and the trash on the floor. A heavy smell of dampness and desolation hung in the air. The same metallic sound repeated, clear and distinct. 3 knocks, a short pause, then 3 more. The officers exchanged glances, nodded to each other, and pointed their flashlights at the hatch. The lock was indeed new, and showed no signs of rust. Amidst the general decay and filth, this looked suspicious. It was immediately clear that there was no time to delay. One of the officers went out to the car and returned with a heavy crowbar. A few strong blows, and the padlock fell to the wooden floor with a crash. When the hatch was opened, a sharp, suffocating smell rose up from below, causing both officers to involuntarily recoil. Forcing themselves, they aimed their flashlights inside, trying to make out something in the depths of the basement. At first, there was complete silence. Then, a quiet sound of movement was heard from below. In the dim light, 2 faces appeared, pale and frightened. They were Kasia and Pavel. The girl was about 19, the boy about 14. Both looked extremely exhausted, their clothes hanging on them in dirty rags, their hair matted, their eyes struggling to react to the light of the flashlights. The officers helped them climb out, holding their arms as they could barely walk on their own. At 11:45 p.m., they were brought outside and placed in the patrol car. The girl was covered with a jacket, and the boy was given a bottle of water. Both barely spoke and responded only with slight head movements to questions about whether they could hear and understand what was happening. An ambulance was urgently called to the scene. The paramedics arrived quickly and confirmed the initial assessment: severe exhaustion, dehydration, and serious hypothermia. Both were immediately sent to the hospital. Meanwhile, the police officers returned to the hatch to document the situation in the basement. It was cold, dirty, and dark below. An old mattress lay on the floor, soaked with moisture and covered in mold. In the corner stood a plastic bucket, clearly serving as a toilet. Nearby on the floor lay a metal spoon, covered in dirt and rust. The officers immediately realized that it was with this spoon that Kasia had been signaling for help. The house and the surrounding area were cordoned off, with officers posted to guard the crime scene. Jan Kowalski stood near his truck, watching as the investigators worked and documented the evidence they found. He was gradually realizing that he had become an unwilling participant in a truly terrifying and complicated story. A little later, the officers reported the initial details of the case to the station via radio, officially classifying it as a serious crime. The exact time of arrival at the scene and the moment the victims were discovered were entered into the protocol. Even at that moment, it was obvious that a routine police call had become the beginning of one of the most high-profile and complex investigations in the region in recent years. The rescued Kasia and Pavel were already at the hospital, while a large-scale investigation continued at the scene. Police officers meticulously examined the house and the surrounding area, documenting every little detail. It was obvious that the discovery in the basement was just the beginning, and they would have to delve much deeper into the situation. Meanwhile, police officers were on duty at the hospital, waiting for the doctors to give permission for an initial interview with the victims. Kasia was the first to speak. Despite her extreme exhaustion, she was able to answer questions briefly and clearly. Her voice was quiet, and she struggled to find her words, but the girl still managed to explain who was behind what had happened in the abandoned house. Kasia gave a name: Zbigniew Nowak. She explained that he never used his own name. He demanded to be called Father, forbidding any other form of address. Kasia learned his name by chance. One day she noticed an old miner's ID that Nowak had carelessly dropped on the floor. The document showed his name and photograph. Kasia memorized this information immediately, realizing it could be important. Checking the name took less than 10 minutes. In the Silesian police database, Zbigniew Nowak was listed as a former miner, 52 years old, with a criminal record for domestic disputes and threats. After being laid off from the mine, he lived on benefits, abused alcohol, and had no family. His wife had left him several years ago, and neighbors described him as withdrawn, rude, and prone to aggression. His address was a private house on the outskirts of Chrzanów, not far from the abandoned settlement of Żarki. The investigators immediately realized they had found an important lead. According to their data, Nowak was indeed often in that area, collecting scrap metal, hauling away old equipment. Everything indicated that he could have been using the abandoned house as a temporary shelter and a place to hide the victims. The information quickly reached the duty officer. A decision was made to detain him. The police knew that Nowak was an unpredictable person, especially when intoxicated, and that they needed to act quickly. If he realized the police knew of his involvement, he might flee or try to destroy evidence. An alert was sent out to all patrols in the area. The first place to search was a bar in the center of Chrzanów, where Zbigniew was often seen in the evenings. Several patrol cars headed there at once. They approached quietly, without sirens. The bar was crowded, music was playing, and none of the patrons suspected that several people had entered not for leisure. The police calmly walked between the tables, checking the faces of the customers. One of the officers noticed a man in the corner, gray-haired, in a work jacket with an unshaven face. He was sitting over an unfinished glass, leaning on the table with his elbows, and looked tired, almost indifferent to his surroundings. There was no fear on his face, but rather a familiar apathy. It was Zbigniew Nowak. The officers acted quickly and quietly. One approached from behind, another from the side. A few confident moves, and the man was already standing, pressed against the wall. He didn't resist or try to make excuses. He just stayed silent and stared at the floor. Zbigniew Nowak was led out of the bar, placed in a patrol car, and taken to the station. There was no surprise on his face, as if he knew this moment would come sooner or later. While he sat in the hallway of the station, investigators were already reviewing reports and preparing materials for interrogation. Now the case had a name, and that name became the first real lead in the long chain of events that began on the evening Jan Kowalski stopped his truck at the abandoned house. While the officers were transporting Zbigniew Nowak to the station, the meticulous work of the investigation team continued at the crime scene. Investigators returned to the basement to conduct a thorough examination of the room where Kasia and Pavel had been held. Now they could take their time to look at everything that had previously been overlooked, details that often turn out to be the most important. The room was small, a low ceiling, concrete walls, some covered with patches of dampness. The air was stale, heavy, and smelled of mold and rot. Even in the light of powerful flashlights, there were corners where the darkness seemed to absorb the light. The floor was uneven, dirty, with puddles of stagnant water. In the corner lay an old mattress, soaked with moisture and already beginning to decompose. The surface was torn, with clumps of dirty cotton sticking out from inside. Next to it stood a plastic bucket that had been used as a toilet. All of this was documented in the protocol and photographed. Every detail could be crucial for the evidence base. A little further on the floor, investigators noticed dozens of cigarette butts. They were everywhere, near the mattress, by the wall, next to the stairs. At first glance, it was just trash, but the quantity seemed too large. All the findings were carefully collected and packaged for laboratory analysis. Only later, after the forensic examination and the doctor's conclusions, did it become clear that these cigarettes were directly related to the injuries found on Kasia and Pavel. At the time of the inspection, it was just a series of clues that required verification. The most important discovery in the basement was a metal spoon lying by the wall next to a wide water pipe. It had traces of rust and old dirt, but the spoon had clearly been used recently. The metal on the edge was worn down, as if it had been struck repeatedly over a long period. The pipe ran through the entire house and went up to the living quarters. It turned out to be an ideal conductor of sound. Investigators immediately connected this finding with the truck driver Jan Kowalski's story. Everything fell into place. The knocks he had heard were coming from this pipe. Even weak strikes with a metal object produced a sharp resonance that was clearly audible from outside. This was the signal that had exposed everything. A simple spoon turned out to be what saved 2 people. The investigation team continued to document details late into the night. Each piece of evidence was carefully packaged and recorded in the protocol. The basement finally took on the shape of a confined space where people's lives had been reduced for years to a few square meters, a bucket, and pieces of rotten fabric on the floor. The impression of what they saw was heavy, even for those who had worked in the police force for many years. By the time the inspection was complete, it was clear that the investigation had formed an almost complete picture of what had happened. All that remained was to correlate the evidence with the testimonies of Kasia, Pavel, and Novak himself. All the data was already being transmitted to the department, where they were preparing for the first serious interrogation. The night that began with an anxious call to 112 was now being filled with facts, and each one was fitting into a single, terrifyingly real story. The detained Zbigniew Novak was brought to the police station at around 1:30 in the morning. Almost an hour had passed since his arrest at the bar, and now the officers at the station saw him with their own eyes for the first time. The officers who brought the detainee to the station later noted in their reports the man's extremely strange and atypical behavior, especially considering the gravity of the crime he was suspected of. In the first few minutes after he was seated at the station, Nowak appeared completely disoriented and detached. He was silent and did not react to the duty officer's standard questions about his well-being and whether he understood the reasons for his detention. He smelled sharply and strongly of alcohol. It was obvious even from a distance that he had been drinking heavily and for a long time. At one point, the detainee tried to get up from his chair, but immediately sat back down heavily, as if losing his balance. Several times, the duty officer tried to speak with Nowak to find out if he was aware of where he was and why he had been detained. In response, there were only nonsensical phrases, full of disjointed words and broken pauses. His words were a mix of complaints about a headache, requests for water, and quiet assurances that there had been some mistake and the arrest had nothing to do with him. However, a few minutes later, while the officers were filling out the protocol, Novak suddenly uttered a strange and very important phrase. The police officer who was processing the paperwork immediately noted it in the report. The detainee said that he didn't immediately realize his family had been found. The word family that he used immediately caught the attention of the officers on duty. It sounded strange and inappropriate, but at that moment they couldn't understand what Novak meant. The police tried to ask a few clarifying questions, but the man fell silent and said no more. His gaze became vacant again, as if he didn't understand why he had said it or what was wanted from him. Later, when investigators began to connect this phrase with the evidence found in the house, its meaning gradually became clear. They realized it wasn't just a random slip of the tongue or drunken nonsense. The word family directly correlated with what Kasia had said about her time in the basement and Nowak's demands to be called father. It was now becoming obvious that there was a deeper and more frightening motive behind this, related to his personal life and past. The investigators understood that the detainee's phrase would become central to the next stage of the investigation. Their task now was to uncover what exactly Nowak meant by this concept, and how long he had been living in such a horrifying reality that he captured and held other people, forcing them to call him something he was not. While the police were processing the paperwork, preparations for a serious interrogation were already underway in the next room. They knew a difficult and challenging conversation lay ahead, but they also understood that they now had the first serious clue to understanding the detainee's behavior and all the circumstances of this dark case. Novak was already in a temporary holding cell when investigators began receiving the first medical data from the hospital. On the night of October 18, 19, doctors completed their examination of Kasia and Pavel, and by 8 a.m. on October 19, 2023, the official reports were in the hands of the police. These documents, for the first time, clearly and objectively revealed the picture of what had been happening in the basement of the abandoned house. According to the medical reports, the condition of both was critical. Doctors recorded severe exhaustion due to a prolonged lack of food and water. Kasia, who was 19 at the time of the examination, weighed only 37 kilograms, which corresponded to an extreme degree of emaciation and a severe form of dystrophy. Pavel's indicators were even worse. Medics noted a serious developmental delay and an extremely low weight. Furthermore, X-rays revealed old fractures that had healed improperly due to a lack of medical care. Both had injuries to their ribs and wrists, and Kasia also had an old ankle injury. These injuries had been sustained several months before their rescue. However, the most important piece of evidence was discovered by doctors during the initial examination: characteristic round skin lesions on the victim's hands and forearms. Some of the lesions looked fresh, while others had already scarred over. The doctors immediately notified the police, and by morning, forensic specialists had arrived at the hospital and meticulously documented the marks. The examination continued throughout the day, and around 8 p.m., the investigators received a report. According to the forensic experts' conclusions, the round lesions were burns, fully consistent with marks from cigarette butts. This led to the assumption that the cigarette butts found in the basement could have been the instrument used to inflict the injuries. A further comparative analysis was required for final confirmation. This data significantly influenced the course of the investigation. Whereas previously the suspect's actions were classified only as unlawful imprisonment, the police were now also considering the charge of torture, which elevated the case to the category of a particularly serious crime. Thus, the investigation obtained serious grounds for further work. The officers understood that they would need to conduct additional forensic analysis, check for possible false leads, and study Zbigniew Nowak's past. Only after that could they proceed to the first serious conversation with the suspect to definitively establish his motives. While forensic experts were examining the cigarette butts and the results of the medical examinations, investigators returned to re-inspect the living quarters of Zbigniew Nowak's house. The basement had already provided many important details, but something significant could also be hidden upstairs. The police needed to understand what Nowak was doing when no one was watching. The inside of the house looked like the typical abandoned dwelling of a person with alcohol addiction. Things, clothes, bottles, and old trash were scattered everywhere. The rooms had an unpleasant smell of alcohol and dampness. At first, it seemed that nothing useful would be found. But in the corner of one of the rooms, the investigators discovered something unexpected. Piles of scrap metal lay against the wall, rusty pipes, pieces of wire, metal parts, and rebar. It was all neatly sorted and clearly prepared to be turned in at a collection point. Some of the items had not yet collected dust, meaning they had been gathered recently. The forensic team documented the find and confirmed that the metal had been sorted and prepared for a specific purpose. This discovery became key. The investigators quickly linked it to Kasia and Pavel's condition. It was obvious that they were likely the ones performing this hard physical labor. Now, in addition to systematic infliction of pain, another motive emerged: using the captives as a labor force. Thus, the investigators had a dual motive for the crime. The cigarette butts and burns pointed to cruelty, while the sorted metal indicated exploitation. The house, which at first glance seemed to be just the neglected home of a person with alcohol addiction, turned out to be a place with a clear system of coercion. The investigation had obtained important grounds for further work. The experts had to definitively confirm the link between the found items and the victim's injuries. What lay ahead was a deeper analysis of the suspect's past to find out what had led Zbigniew Nowak to such actions. While forensic experts were studying the cigarette butts and burns, investigators requested all materials related to the village of Żarki from the Chrzanów police archives. This was a standard procedure, but it led the investigation to an unexpected discovery. It turned out that 6 months before the current events, in April 2023, the police had received a call from a local mushroom picker. He reported that while gathering mushrooms, he saw the pale and frightened face of a young girl in the window of an abandoned house in Żarki. The call was officially registered and marked as requiring a check. A duty patrol was immediately dispatched to the scene, but the police officers treated the check as a formality. They only inspected the house from their car. The report stated that the house was abandoned, the windows were boarded up, and there were no signs of anyone's presence. The officers concluded that the mushroom picker had mistaken a reflection for a person or had seen one of the vagrants who often appeared in the area. The check was closed at that point. Now, 6 months later, the investigators were reading the old report with completely different eyes. The face in the window most likely belonged to Kasia. In April, she was already in the house and might have noticed the mushroom picker, trying to attract attention in some way. It became obvious to the investigators that this was an opportunity to prevent everything that happened later. But due to a superficial check, the opportunity was missed. This discovery in the archives became a painful point for the investigation. The police leadership understood that an internal investigation would be unavoidable. The responsibility of the patrol officers was now a separate and difficult issue. Now the investigation had not just a missed chance, but also a serious reason to re-examine the entire case. The archival call, which at first glance seemed like a formality, actually revealed the depth of the tragedy and showed how important every overlooked detail had been. A new stage awaited the investigators, a detailed study of Zbigniew Nowak's personality and past. Only this could help them understand how he had come to this and why this particular house had become part of his plan. Investigators requested all available archives, personal documents, and materials from past inquiries related to Nowak. Soon, old police reports, medical records, and witness interview transcripts about a family conflict from 2015 were laid out on the officers' desks. The materials showed that 8 years ago, Nowak's wife had officially sought help from the police. She claimed her husband was regularly cruel and aggressive toward her and their children, which forced her to leave home. According to her statement, physical conflicts were constant and unbearable, and in one instance, she even had to go to the hospital for treatment after sustaining injuries. An important detail in the case was that his 2 minor children, an older daughter and a younger son, left with his wife. The departure of his family completely destroyed Nowak's personal life, leaving him in solitude and isolation. This was confirmed by neighbors, whom the investigators interviewed again. They said that after his family left, the former miner's behavior changed drastically. He became withdrawn, rarely communicated, drank heavily, and spent his time alone. Sometimes, neighbors noticed him talking to himself while wandering through the abandoned settlement. Zbigniew had previously been a miner and had worked at the local mine for many years, but after the plant closed, he found himself without a job or a means of livelihood. left without a stable income, he began collecting and selling scrap metal that he found in the abandoned worker settlements, so-called osadi, scattered throughout the region. This life not only worsened his psychological state, but also became an important part of the overall picture of the crime. Criminal psychologists, after carefully studying his biography and witness testimonies, concluded that the loss of his family could have caused the suspect serious psychological trauma. In prolonged social isolation and dire financial straits, he gradually built a new reality around himself, in which he tried to replicate his lost family. This could have led him to kidnap Kasia and Pavel, who became unwilling participants in a horrific, distorted reenactment. The investigators once again recalled the words spoken by the suspect upon his arrest. At the time, the police had thought his statements were incoherent and caused by alcohol. But now, these phrases became clear. He demanded that the abductees address him with the word normally used for a parent because he wanted to regain the feeling of family.
For him, this was not just a game or a form of control, but a real attempt to restore his own lost life. Thus, from seemingly separate, disparate facts, a complete and grim profile of the crime was constructed before the investigation. The police now had two clear motives: the physical exploitation of the abductees to earn money from collecting scrap metal, and a psychological motive: the restoration of the family structure he had lost 8 years ago. The investigation had a complete psychological profile of Zbigniew Nowak and a clear understanding of his motives. The collected materials allowed the officers to begin preparing for the next, decisive stage of the investigation: a tough interrogation of the suspect. Now, knowing his psychology, his weak spots, and the reasons for his behavior, the investigators were ready to structure the interrogation in such a way that Nowak could no longer hide the truth.
When the investigators entered the interrogation room, Nowak looked completely different from when he was arrested. Completely sobered up, he sat at the table with his head down, avoiding eye contact with the officers. The police had all the necessary materials and evidence in their hands. The investigators knew where to start and how to conduct the conversation to break down his attempts to defend himself step by step. First, the officers laid out the medical photos in front of him, clearly showing the round burn marks on the victim's hands. Experts had already confirmed the injuries were a perfect match for the cigarette butts found in the suspect's house. Nowak glanced at the photos briefly and immediately looked away. He began to assure the investigators that he had not hurt anyone and had nothing to do with these injuries, although his voice sounded uncertain and his words seemed contrived and unconvincing. Then the officers moved on to the next piece of evidence. They spread photos of the scrap metal discovered in the house and prepared for sale on the table. When Nowak claimed that Kasia and Pavel had helped him voluntarily, the investigators directly reminded him of the basement, locked with a padlock, and the complete impossibility for Kasia and Pavel to leave freely. Nowak had no answer for this, clearly flustered and realizing that any explanation would sound nonsensical. Seeing this, the investigators gradually shifted the conversation to his past. They calmly and briefly reminded him that they knew how his wife had left him many years ago with their older daughter and younger son because of his difficult character. Hearing this, Nowak fell silent, tensed up, and lowered his gaze even further. He clearly had not expected the investigators to bring up this topic. The main blow came from Kasia's testimony. The investigators read her words, recorded in the interrogation transcript. Nowak forced them both to call him father, ojciec. These words,
perfectly matched the conclusions of the psychologists, who believed the suspect was trying to recreate the family he had lost many years ago. Hearing this, Nowak froze. His face became completely still, and the officers felt that he could no longer deny the obvious. For a while, the room was quiet. The investigators deliberately did not break the silence, giving the suspect time to realize the hopelessness of his situation. At that moment, the officers had another irrefutable piece of evidence prepared, which Nowak did not yet know about. It was this clue that was supposed to finally strip him of any ability to deny the charges and lead the investigation to a full confession. Nowak remained silent, not giving the investigation the answers it needed. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Kasia and Pavel had told investigators far more than the suspect could have imagined. Their testimonies became the decisive proof of how and why the two people had spent so much time in captivity without ever attempting to escape. The officers listened attentively to Kasia, who looked extremely exhausted and subdued, but firmly explained how their daily routine was structured. The basement where they were found served not just as a place to sleep, but as a literal prison cell. The hatch was always locked from above with a heavy padlock, and only Nowak had the key. He would only let them out when he was going to work or to the local bar in Chrzanów. Kasia described a typical day in detail. Every morning, Nowak would take them out of the basement and force them to walk through the village, where they would collect scrap metal from abandoned houses. They handled small metal parts, pieces of wire, fasteners, and rebar. Nowak himself carried anything heavier. Pavel clarified an important detail. He came to be with Nowak almost a year after Kasia was already there. By that time, the girl was completely broken and didn't even try to resist. In the first few days, Pavel noticed how terrified she was of her captor, and he soon understood why. Early in his stay, Nowak showed cruelty to him as well, inflicting severe pain and leaving the first burns from cigarette butts. In this way, he immediately made it clear to Pavel what consequences awaited him for any disobedience. This physical violence, already familiar to Kasia, quickly broke his will too. After that, a deep fear completely crushed them psychologically. Over time, constant malnutrition and physical exhaustion were added to the cruelty, definitively robbing both of them of the ability to resist or try to escape. Nowak was always nearby, watching their every move. He constantly held a tire iron, and even when drunk, he remained aggressive and unpredictable. Any attempt to deviate from his instructions was met with quiet but specific threats. The village was completely isolated. The nearest populated area, Chrzanów, was almost 10 kilometers away. Combined with malnutrition, this made any ideas of escape pointless. Experts confirmed to the investigation that such a combination of cruelty, physical control, and psychological pressure effectively suppresses the will of victims. The victims did not attempt to flee simply because they had long lost faith in such a possibility. Thus, the picture of the crime became clear and consistent. First, Nowak broke them with physical violence, then reinforced the result with psychological pressure, creating conditions in which escape became meaningless. Kasia and Pavel's testimonies were now not just their memories, but irrefutable evidence, proving the methodical and deliberate system of violent control organized by the suspect.
The investigators now had all the necessary materials and testimonies to secure a final confession from Novak. The next move was his. Further denial was pointless. The investigation was fully prepared. All that remained was to hear his own words. The police officers believed that Novak had no chance of escaping responsibility. All the case materials were already on the table. Medical reports, forensic results, witness testimonies. But Novak still stubbornly denied the acts of torture. In the final interrogation, he tried to present the entire incident as a mutual agreement and voluntary help. During the conversation with the officers, Novak was cautious, sometimes stumbling over his words, avoiding eye contact. His fingers trembled noticeably as he repeated the same story, over and over. He had picked up Kasia and Pavel when they were on the streets and in need of help. He insisted that he had simply given them a roof over their heads, and they had agreed to help with collecting scrap metal of their own free will. He explained the harsh conditions of their life by his poverty and chronic alcoholism, trying to evoke sympathy or at least understanding from the investigators. But when the conversation turned back to the physical harm, including the burns, Novak became visibly nervous. His eyes darted around the interrogation room, and his words became less confident. He insisted that the injuries had occurred accidentally during work and that he was not directly responsible for them. But the officers already knew exactly how to break this story. Pavel's testimony proved to be the key. Recalling the episode that became a turning point for him, Pavel described in detail the situation with a metal radiator. He explained that he had accidentally dropped the heavy metal object, and Novak had immediately approached him, silently and deliberately pressing a burning cigarette to his hand. Pavel very clearly remembered the words Novak spoke after. He said that this was how he was teaching Pavel to be careful, so that he would hold on to things entrusted to him better. The officers could see how difficult it was for Pavel to recall this moment. Every word was spoken with noticeable tension, but sounded sincere and convincing, completely demolishing the suspect's version of accidents and voluntariness. Immediately after Pavel, the officers listened to Kasia again. She confirmed every word her companion had said, adding an important detail. At first, they really believed Novak wanted to help them, but his behavior changed very quickly. Threats, punishments, and harsh suppression appeared. Kasia specified that for a long time she was even afraid to think about resisting, as it only led to more cruelty. After presenting these testimonies, Novak's confidence vanished completely. He could no longer offer a convincing rebuttal, only repeating quietly and incoherently that they had misunderstood everything. However, his excuses now looked pathetic and helpless. At this stage, the investigation had a complete and clear chain of events. First, Novak deceptively created the appearance of helping, and then he subdued Kasia and Pavel with physical cruelty and threats, turning their lives into constant fear and helplessness. The officers now had all the necessary facts, confirming not just the kidnapping, but also torture, imprisonment, and the absolute suppression of the personalities of both victims. The investigation had complete and exhaustive information. All that remained was to reconstruct every event in the correct sequence, step by step. It was now possible to confidently move to the next stage of the investigation, a detailed reconstruction of how exactly Kasia and Pavel ended up in Novak's hands, and how their lives ultimately came under his control. The task force approached the final stage of the investigation. It was now necessary to fully reconstruct the entire picture of what had happened. The events were reconstructed step by step, from the moment of the abduction to the night Kasia and Pavel were rescued. In the fall of 2021, 17-year-old Kasia ran away from an orphanage in Katowice. She was heading toward Krakow, hoping to find work and start a new life, but soon found herself without money or help on the outskirts of the town of Chrzanów. It was here that Zbigniew Nowak noticed her. The man appeared calm and offered help, food, and a temporary place to stay. Kasia agreed, not yet understanding that this decision would change her life forever. The first few days, nothing seemed amiss, but when the girl tried to leave, Nowak immediately became aggressive. Trying to restrain her, he pushed Kasia hard onto the concrete steps, and that day she suffered her first serious arm fracture, which was later documented by experts as old and improperly healed. It was after this incident that the girl first experienced Nowak's cruel method of punishment, a cigarette burn. Thus began her new reality, fear and complete submission. In the summer of 2022, Nowak acquired a second captive, Pavel, a homeless teenager from Chrzanów who had been living on the streets for a long time. Nowak offered Pavel food and work for a few days. The teenager trusted him, not yet suspecting that he had fallen into a trap. In the first few days, Pavel saw Kasia, withdrawn and frightened, but before he could understand what was happening, he received his first lesson in obedience. Nowak hit him for a mistake that Pavel couldn't even recall. This attack left the teenager with a broken rib, and soon he felt the first cigarette burn on his skin, which left a permanent mark. Thus, Kasia and Pavel were trapped in a brutal cycle of daily violence and hard labor. Every day, Nowak forced them to collect scrap metal in the abandoned houses of the village of Żarki. Around them was only desolate emptiness. Thus, Kasia and Pavel were trapped in a brutal cycle of daily violence and hard labor. Every day, Nowak forced them to collect scrap metal in the abandoned houses of the village of Żarki. Around them was only desolate emptiness. The nearest populated area was 10 kilometers away. Any attempt to speak to someone or leave was instantly met with cruel punishments. This explained the numerous old injuries, fractures, and burns, later documented by the forensic medical examination. Every evening, Nowak would lock his captives in the basement of the house with a massive padlock. Inside, it was dirty, damp, and dark. Only a mattress and a bucket made up the entire furnishings. It was here, on the floor, that a metal spoon, accidentally left by Nowak, was found. At the time, no one paid it any mind, but it was what ultimately saved their lives. The investigators were particularly careful in reconstructing the events of April 2023, the missed opportunity to rescue Kasia and Pavel sooner. A local resident who was picking mushrooms reported to the police that he had seen a pale girl's face in the window of an abandoned house in the village of Żarki. A patrol from the Chrzanów police was dispatched to check, but after only a cursory inspection of the house, without even getting out of the car, they concluded that vagrants were simply living inside. This mistake cost the captives another 6 months of suffering. The key night came on October 25, 2023. As usual, Nowak went to a bar after locking the captives in the basement. About an hour later, Kasia heard a sound she could not mistake for anything else, the heavy engine of a truck. The girl immediately realized it was a stranger's vehicle. In a desperate attempt to get attention, she grabbed that same spoon and began to rhythmically beat it against the wide cast-iron water pipe that ran through the house. Upstairs, the truck driver, Jan Kowalski, who had ended up in the village due to a GPS failure, heard the unusual metallic knocking. It was he who called the police, and a patrol soon arrived at the scene. After breaking the lock and opening the hatch, the police found the emaciated and tormented Kasia and Pavel. All the evidence, the spoon, the lock, the mattress, the bucket, and the old injuries, was immediately documented, forming a clear picture of the crime. The investigation had now finally closed the entire chain of events, from the moment of abduction to the victim's rescue. Every piece of evidence and every testimony perfectly matched the reconstruction. The task force had a complete picture of the crime, ready to be presented in court. The case, which had shocked the region with its cruelty and cynicism, was practically closed. On March 15, 2024, several months after the investigation concluded, the trial of Zbigniew Nowak began at the Katowice District Court.
The proceedings were held behind closed doors. The details of the case were too disturbing for a public hearing. The prosecution had assembled a convincing body of evidence that investigators had painstakingly built over several months. Medical reports, physical evidence, thoroughly verified witness testimonies, and a detailed reconstruction of events that confirmed the defendant's guilt. The indictment listed 4 serious crimes: the kidnapping of 2 individuals, one of whom was a minor at the time of the crime, unlawful imprisonment, torture, and forcing the victims to perform hard physical labor with no possibility of refusal. The prosecution emphasized that Nowak had deliberately chosen victims who could not defend themselves or resist. During the trial, Nowak continued to deny the seriousness of his actions, stubbornly claiming that he had wanted to help the victims by giving them shelter and food in exchange for simple work. However, this version did not stand up to scrutiny at any stage of the trial. The testimonies of Kasia and Pavel about the brutal methods of control and punishment, corroborated by forensic medical examinations, unequivocally destroyed his defense. In his verdict, the judge noted the particular cruelty of Nowak's crimes, stressing that the physical injuries, fractures, cigarette burns, and extreme emaciation were inflicted intentionally and systematically. The court considered it proven that the defendant had deliberately kept the victims in complete isolation, controlling their every move through fear and physical force, and depriving them of even the slightest chance of escape. After a thorough review of all case materials and witness testimonies, the court found Zbigniew Nowak guilty on all charges. The sentence was as severe as possible: 25 years of imprisonment in a maximum security penal colony without the right to parole. Nowak received the sentence with outward calm, showing no visible emotion. A heavy atmosphere hung in the courtroom. No one felt relief or joy. But one thing was clear: justice had been served. The case, which had caused a major public outcry in the region, was officially closed, and Nowak was sent to serve his sentence. After Zbigniew Nowak was sent to serve his sentence, the fates of those who survived this story turned out differently. Kasia, who had previously run away from an orphanage and had no close relatives, was placed under the care of social services. She was sent to a specialized center near Katowice, where she underwent long-term psychotherapy and a course of medical recovery. Psychologists noted that Kasia was gradually returning to a normal life, but the consequences of her trauma required constant and long-term work with specialists. Pavel found himself in a similar situation. Having no family, he ended up in a rehabilitation center in Krakow that specializes in teenagers who have suffered severe psychological and physical trauma.
There, Pavel worked regularly with psychologists and doctors. His physical condition gradually improved, but specialists warned that the deep psychological consequences would remain for many years to come. Jan Kowalski, who became their accidental savior, completely shunned public attention and did not give detailed interviews to the press. He consistently emphasized that he did not consider his actions heroic and insisted that he simply happened to be in the right place and heard a suspicious sound. Jan returned to his usual job as a truck driver on the Katowice-Kraków route, trying not to dwell on the events of that night. One aspect of the case remained without public resolution. The internal service investigation concerning the actions of the police patrol that had ignored the mushroom picker's call in April 2023 received no publicity. The police officially confirmed the start of the investigation, but its results were never made known to the general public. Thus, the case of Zbigniew Nowak was completely closed. The investigation identified the culprit, determined his motives and methods of imprisonment, gathered irrefutable evidence, and secured a just sentence. The only unresolved episode remained the question of negligence on the part of the police officers who had allowed the opportunity for Kasia and Pavel's earlier rescue to be missed. That page of the case remained closed.